Welcome to Multilayered Identity Verification and Machine Learning. My name is Rosalie Griebel. I'm a product director for Regulatory Compliance Group at Computer Services, Inc. I'll introduce my panel first and then kind of give an introduction of the topic. It'll be sort of an open discussion across a couple of different subject matters, deep diving into these concepts. So with me today, I have Erin Coppin. She's the Senior Compliance Officer at Airbnb, and her focus is primarily around AML, financial crimes compliance, as well as know your customer controls. I also have David Brummond. He's a counsel at Jacobson, Burton, and Kelley, specializing in sanctions compliance law, and his focus is primarily around the financial sector within compliance and sanctions law. And then I have John Dancu, who's the CEO at IDology. They develop leading-edge innovations in both identity and fraud spaces. So I'm going to start by caveating this by saying that none of us are deep machine learning experts. This won't be a technical conversation. It'll be more of a practitioner's conversation, just around the different points of view that each of the panelists bring to the table around some of these topics. From an operational and practice perspective from Erin, from a legal and regulatory perspective from David, and from an industry trend and technology perspective from John. So I'm going to kind of kick it off just from an overview. As suppliers of products and services, we all find ourselves in a struggle around preserving customer experience while also meeting data privacy and consumer protection regulation and requirements, preventing and mitigating data breaches, and combating cybercrime, and competing in a global economy now. And that list goes on and on with challenges and struggles. So a lot of these conditions have led to an increased need for much more rapid and complex systems to verify customer identity, assess customer risk, and detect fraud. So as a result, we're seeing that organizations are being pushed to explore and incorporate much more advanced technology solutions. And that's led to the advent of what we call multi-layered identity verification, using a variety and a host of different data sources, as well as different verification mechanisms. So we'll hear, a lot about biometrics, document verification, OCR, lots of different technologies, all sort of driven underlying concepts of machine learning as well. And that's all really to understand customer identity at a much deeper level and adapt to rapid changes. So just some examples to kind of explain multi-layered IDV. You may have decision trees or decision matrix where you escalate a customer through a process based on answers to previous information or questions as you're validating data. And that can be very complex, and of course that has to happen in real time. The customer is waiting to have the product or service satisfied, but you need to be compliant and make sure that that information is being vetted properly and that you understand your risk. And so a lot of that then is augmented by machine learning capability behind the scenes. So the volume of transactions and requests is growing and increasing. And so one of the big challenges that machine learning can help with is to augment analyst effort in due diligence by providing recommendations based on previous analyst activity to help with fraud detection and resolution of fraud cases, AML cases, whether it's sanctions, due diligence, or know your customer vetting initially as well. So this convergence of technology and compliance can sometimes move faster than companies or regulators. So today we're going to have the panelists kind of talk about some of the business challenges and problems from their different points of view. Again, bringing in that operational perspective as well as the legal and regulatory and technology to discuss how organizations can navigate through some of these challenges as well as incorporate new technologies like machine learning. And one of the things that we talked about in preparation for this is how machine learning really is this sexy topic, but is it just hype, or are there viable implementations going on? What can people do with that, and what are some of the resource requirements and constraints around really truly implementing a technology like that? So I'm going to kick it off and start with a couple of questions. We'll just kind of go across the panel and discuss some of these. So from each of your perspectives, I'm going to ask each of you to kind of overview what you believe some of the biggest challenges that organizations and businesses are facing going into this year and the future around verifying customer identity and understanding customer risk, whether we're talking about know your customer, initial onboarding, or AML, ongoing monitoring, or just identity in general. So I'll maybe start with David, if you don't mind, just to talk about what some of the legal challenges and regulatory challenges are out there today.
Thank you, Rosalie. I have to say it's a pretty daunting world out there in the legal and regulatory space, trying to keep up with where things are going. And I would say from an organization standpoint, the two types of challenges are, one, keeping up with it, knowing what it is that is being put in place that's a requirement, either statutory, regulatory, or by an agency, just having the capacity to know in the different contexts what is the new rules that have to be met. And secondly, how to adjust to be in compliance with them. And the adjustment is both in the term of adjusting systems so that they are now updated to whatever the new requirements are, and training so that the people that are doing these functions with these systems are now aware of how they do it differently. And that's a very daunting challenge. And I would just like to give a very brief overview of why that is such a demanding task by citing some of the legal requirements that are now what everybody is struggling with. And I would define them in two kind of forms. One is what I would call hard requirements. These are new rules, things that have evolved that are now going to be or are in play as operative legal requirements. And the list is GDPR, the new system requirements for how you manage privacy if you have any contact with dealing with European data, FinCEN, SARS, the activity reports that are required are now changing as to what you have to have in them. The suspiciousness includes data elements. And the cybersecurity rules in the financial sector, the New York Department of Financial Services has just put in place new requirements, an array of different things that you need to have to be in compliant in New York. Those are the hard requirements. You can go look and see the rules, you track and see what they are. And then there's the soft requirements. Okay, what do I mean by that? They're existing rules, requirements that are evolving in a more sophisticated, demanding way. And an example is know your customer. Okay, as you deal with a more complex environment and a wider market, the rules for what it is that you have to do to know your customer, the rules aren't changing, but the context in which they're operating are much more challenging than they were before. So KYC. And a second softer requirement is the due diligence that comes with OFAC compliance, where in the past it's been accepted that as long as you perform the due diligence, you were within safe boundary of OFAC compliance. Well, that's a moving target. And even though the concept due diligence hasn't changed in terms of what is the requirement, how it's expected to be implemented has. And so keeping up with that is daunting.
Yeah. Okay. So I'll actually hand it over to you, Erin, to kind of counteract that. So you at Airbnb, and you can speak, generally what you see in the marketplace from a practitioner's perspective, what the challenge looks like to be able to implement those regulatory demands.
Sure, and I don't think I would counteract it. I think I would support it. It is a daunting environment out there. I think from a practitioner's point of view, the two things that are probably top of mind for me day to day are data quality. We have more data than we've ever had, but how good is it? Where is it coming from? Often it's on a spectrum from really, really solid data sources, sometimes supplemented by third parties. Sometimes you have instances where the business has solicited information from the customer and that's sitting over here, and that data becomes a liability because you don't know about it, you haven't done anything with it. And then in the face of things like GDPR, or even New York's model validation, how good is your data pipeline? How aware are you of your data pipeline? And how well does your data infrastructure support the kinds of things you want to build, like machine learning models, right? Your outputs are only as good as your inputs there.
Right.
So it's something that we think about a lot. At the same time, we have more behavior-based data than we've ever had before about our customers. And as you think about a more nuanced KYC, all of that is playing into it. The second thing I spend a lot of time thinking about is actually staffing. When you think about these concepts, traditionally an AML compliance department was not a very technical department. And as I think about growing my team, both from within Airbnb, how we're structuring, or any company for that matter, how we're structuring who is on our team to what the traditional compliance person has to know. If we have to explain how our model was designed and built to a regulator, or if we have to explain how we'd like to design and build our model to an engineer, that's a much different skill set than we've looked at in the past. So I'm really thinking proactively about how we're going to build that out.
Right. So John, from your perspective, just from a industry trend and technology, what are some of the challenges that you're seeing?
Sure. So I think what we have to remember is that we're trying to onboard customers here. And customers don't care about any of this stuff. Mm-hmm. They really don't. And all they want to do is sign up and be able to do the transaction that they want. And so, yeah, for sure, we have to make sure that we're in compliance with all the stuff and doing it. But what's the consumer experience about? And as the market gets more difficult, right, with more fraud and sophistication from fraudsters, part of the strategy has been, well, let's throw more things at it. Let's have them scan a license. Let's have them take a selfie. The winner for this are the groups that can basically validate consumers without friction and make it really easy and legitimate for that person to basically onboard. While at the same point in time, stop the fraud. And the fraudsters are getting more and more sophisticated about this stuff. And remember, the people that are committing fraud are making changes every minute, every hour, versus big companies who take months, if not years, to make changes, right, for the process. So, when you talk with fraudsters about machine learning, they love machine learning because it gives them the ability to try to figure things out, right? Because that's what they're always doing. They're probing and trying to determine how can I basically beat the system. So machine learning has a double-edged sword relative to that. But to us, the biggest challenge is, how do we make this seamless for the consumer? How do we make the experience of being validated, meeting compliance, making sure you get all the government stuff, but also making sure that you're onboarding legitimate customers to basically help our customers drive revenue, because that's what this is all about, right? This is about giving access and ease of use to consumers when they're on the internet or on their smartphone.
Mm-hmm. Yep. So just to dive a little deeper into what multi-layered KYC or identity verification really is, and what's driving the need for that, and how to vet customers, I'd go back to David to talk maybe a little more in detail about some of the requirements around due diligence, specifically what are some of the steps that organizations and analysts need to take. You mentioned SARS filings and other requirements. So, there's certainly, you can quickly identify customer risk, with some customers, but then if there's something suspicious, what do you do next? What are the next steps, and what's required from that, the hard requirements and soft requirements from a regulatory expectation?
Well, to take what due diligence means as maybe the best example, I can only go back to say that for 8 years I was with the Treasury Department and was on the end of the call that said, okay, what do I need to do? How much due diligence do I need to do? And I always have a standard answer to that is it depends on what it is that is the risk that you're facing. Due diligence is risk-based, and that principle permeates through all of the regulations that we've mentioned. It's in the SARS, FinCEN has this, it's in OFAC, it's in the New York Department of Financial Services. Regulators can't know from their perspective, is this something that may come back and be a problem for them if they say that's enough, that's fine? They're not going to make a commitment to tell you, okay, if you do A, B, and C, you're good. That's not going to happen. Okay, so you as the compliance entity that needs to meet these requirements, need to make a judgment call on how much does this look like it has indicia of some type of problem or risk. And the more that occurs, the deeper you need to go. And that's a principle that is difficult to define any further because it's all context. And I'll give an example for what would come in to me. If you're a multi-national insurer and you're global writing risk and you happen to write cargo insurance and you have a risk that's going from Dubai to Italy, okay? Chances are there's a possibility that something in that shipment or the source or the players might have some connection possibly to Iran. Dubai is close to that. It's known to be a place. So in that context, you go a little deeper in what's the circumstances of that cargo coverage. Okay, who are the players? Okay, where did it come from? And use a little more intensity in your searching. And all I can say is that's as much as you're going to get guidance from the regulator, and the rest is judgment and risk-based fact scenarios that you develop judgment on over time.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it's an interesting point, and that's where people I think gravitate to machine learning because in the volumes that a lot of organizations are processing as far as transactions and the speed at which they need to be responsive, because again, customers don't, at the end of the day, don't really care. They want the service. Machine learning can certainly step in and help with some of those, that analysis of the different scenarios and be more adaptive than a rules-based type engine. I wonder, John, if you have any input on that and just in general around the requirements for that approach, what factors are driving that to stratify verification and fraud detection, and bringing breaches into that as well because of the amount of data and high-profile data breaches that have occurred recently certainly factor into all of this as a consideration.
Yeah, well, IDology has been around for close to 14 years. About a decade ago, we went under the assumption that all data was breached. So when we saw the Equifax breach, it's like, yeah, okay, same data's out again. So when you do KYC and identity verification, one of the assumptions you basically have to make is that your name, your social, your year of birth is out there. And if you don't believe so, stop by our booth and we'll show you where it is on the dark web. Okay? And we'll help you buy it back, or maybe, I don't know if you can buy it back, but.
Buy a copy?
Yeah. You can get a copy. And by the way, just as a side note, if you haven't gone into the forums on the dark web and seen how people communicate and how they collaborate, go do it. Chris Luttrell, who works at IDology, I'm really worried one day the FBI is going to bang on our door and basically bust Chris because she's always in the forums communicating with fraudsters. But anyhow, that's a distraction. So the multi-layer. So multi-layer is really, really important from a standpoint of you have to validate the data, but is the person that's giving you the data really the person that's doing it versus a fraudster, right? So the way that we look at it is you have to look at, we call it device, location, activity-based attributes that are basically around that transaction. I'll talk about one of those, and that's activity-based attributes. The other way to beat fraudsters is to collaborate just like they do. They're really active collaborators, and when they figure out something, a weakness, they let everybody know about it because it's just important to them. That's why they do it. They're trying to beat the man. So that means that us as companies also need to collaborate. And consortium data is very, very important relative to that, right? So the ability to be able to say, hey, this transaction happened over here, or some essence or attribute of that transaction happened over at company A, and then we saw something similar in company B, and then we saw it again in company C. You know, that you can refer to that as machine learning, right? We're getting more data, and the machine's getting smarter from that standpoint. But consortium data and collaboration among companies is really critical relative to making sure that we're onboarding the right people. And granted, it catches the fraud, but remember, by catching fraud, you're also validating and vetting the legitimate people that are getting through the process. So that's an example of a layer.
Mm-hmm. So, Erin, I guess in the same vein, from a practical implementation and practitioner's perspective, are there things that you're seeing or attempting to do to stratify the way that you do identity verification or monitoring, whether it's from a technology perspective or just resources to adapt to that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think similar to my my previous point on staffing, I think we're constantly changing the way that we're thinking about the approach, the layers of information that we need to collect about a customer. KYC and multi-layered IDV is actually not a new concept at all in financial services. Mm-hmm. In the face-to-face world of not that long ago, you would talk to your customer, you'd get soft signal from the way they were behaving or their reluctance to provide you certain information. And so all of that is kind of old trick in the AML compliance world. And the trick now is doing it in a way that meets the customer's expectations in terms of timing. And I think you're really seeing compliance kind of stepping forward, because this is an old skill set and an old way of looking at things, into a new role in the company. We used to sort of be that old joke of the compliance cost center, and we're trying to repolish our reputation, because I think compliance actually has a lot to add to the IDV, and now to be able to say to the kind of the bottom line of the company, in terms of fighting fraud. Mm-hmm. So that's not really getting into the specifics, but I think the answer is yes. Nobody's really sitting back on their heels right now. To many of the previous points that were made in at the keynote and in previous panels, it's changing faster than we can address it. Mm-hmm. Right? And so I think as we think about staffing out and building these functions, it needs to become a little more front and center in the organization, part of a more cohesive strategy about thinking about identity and trust and how it affects the bottom line.
Right.
Yeah.
So with regard to cost and resources, I wonder, and anybody on the panel, thoughts around insourcing versus outsourcing some of the technology capability. Certainly there are companies out there that specialize, but sort of finding that balance between bringing some of that in-house, especially for fintech and technology companies that are having to combat this. There may be a desire to develop some of these technologies internally rather than outsourcing. So I wonder, and that's open to anyone who has thoughts about that on insourcing versus outsourcing some of the capabilities.
I think that the sort of services around identity have gotten really good at providing certain kinds of things. Sanctions is a good example of that, like databases, negative news, those kinds of things are pretty easy to integrate. some IDV things are pretty easy to integrate. I think what's challenging is that nobody knows your customer better than you do, and your unique data sets about your customer are invaluable. In for Airbnb, for example, we have customers all over the world, and they're transient. So a signal about the user being here versus where their ID is not as beneficial for us, necessarily as it might be somewhere else, which goes back to the risk-based approach, right? So a company needs to use a blended method of developing its own in-house tools based on its own data sets, and integrating some of the third-party signal that you can get using your own data.
Well, I'm biased, but I'll answer it. I think clearly companies have data that are very important relative to validating the activity of their customers, and it's proprietary to them. And as Erin said, you should use it, right? It's really good data, right, relative to, have you only seen this person once in the last 4 months, or have you seen them 10 times in the last 4 months, right? Those are important things. I think relative to identity and validating people, whether they're at the front or through a step-up authentication, you do need external resources relative to check some of that, and I think it also comes back to the ability to tie into consortium data. Right? You have only so much data within your company, but if you can go through a trusted hub that also has access to other data, then that really just opens up the picture a lot more. So I think it depends on what you're trying to accomplish and the level, the risk of the transaction, how big the transaction is, but clearly I think there's use for both.
And I wonder too about just resource training. So David touched on this, in his opening remarks about the challenges around regulation and compliance and keeping up with that. But then also from a technology perspective, making sure that your human resources, because at the end of the day, I don't think anyone's talking about replacing analysts and people with machine learning capability. It really has to be a combination, a synergy. But getting good resources, identifying people that have training in that and understanding and how to apply, compliance and regulatory pressure to that, I think is an interesting sort of challenge that's out there. I don't know, David or Erin, if you have comments on that as well.
I just have one comment. I recently was part of a webinar that displayed where the most frequent problems arose, and it was interesting to me that more than 25%, 30% of the problems were in the governance area of an institution and not in the technical area. And that surprised me a little bit, so that this idea about knowing the technical capabilities and training to the technical is sometimes given too much focus when there are really institutional, systemic problems, issues, lack of internal awareness of what are the risk and the touch points that maybe need to be given a little bit more attention.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. So we're talking about technology, and there's a lot of emerging trends that are available. And I think those sort of create new challenges as well as help address some of the problems that we're talking about and help counteract some of the complexity that we're faced with. I wonder, John, from your perspective, I know you've touched on some of the technologies, but maybe take a little bit deeper dive into some of the things that are available that you're seeing that can kind of help with this process. And certainly, I think overall there's a consideration around cost, not just the how much these technologies cost from a monetary perspective, but what kind of risk does it present? And maybe, Erin, you can talk about that, to present a new technology into an existing process or system, to have to learn that. And I think we all sort of talked about model validation, which is a huge component of traditional compliance. But with some of these new systems, how do you match your model to something like machine learning that's constantly changing and adapting?
Well, the problems got more complicated, so that means the cost goes up. And unfortunately, that's just the way that it works, right? if fraudsters are trying to go out there using different avenues and different techniques, and you need to add additional layers or checks, some of that can be free, right? Some of it's going to cost money. So unfortunately, as the problem's gotten more complex, it's gotten more expensive, and I don't think that's going to stop. Relative to new technologies, who does not have a phone with them here? Okay, well, that should be important, right? So these devices are becoming pretty important. They're part of our persona. They go everywhere with us. Your bedside table, the bathroom, everywhere, right? So that means from an identity standpoint that phones are becoming pretty important relative to validating who you are, where you are, and what you're doing. And fortunately, the carriers have, they have a lot of good data relative to your activity in your phone, and some of that data can basically be utilized to help validate that you're a legitimate consumer, right? If you are on AT&T for 10 years, you're probably legit. If you have a prepaid phone and it's 14 days old, that's a problem. If you have 4 SIM swaps on your device in the last 2 months, that's a problem, right? And that's all data that the carriers basically have. The carriers also have really good rails for identification, right? You can be in China, pick up your phone and make a phone call. They figure out who you are, and where your phone's going to go, and then they bill you. That's a pretty good rail, right? So if you can basically utilize some of those rails relative to doing identity verification and as another layer, that's important too. So I think as time progresses, you'll see more and more activity happening relative to data around your phone. I think the carriers are, in many cases, their own worst enemy, because how easy is it to port a phone, right? I can pick up, if I have your name, address, social, and year of birth, I can port your phone. And then I can do an account takeover and basically get an OTP and go into your bank account, right? So those are the carriers want to make it really easy for a consumer to basically change from AT&T to Verizon. But at the same point in time, that ease of use makes it easy for fraudsters to basically commit fraud, and the big FIs are having big problems with that right now. So the phone, I think, is the area that's going to be really critically important relative to another layer relative to validating who you are.
So, Erin, from your perspective, what are some of the biggest risks that you see in introducing new technology into your traditional program from either KYC or fraud detection and monitoring?
Well, we already touched a little bit on model validation, so I won't go there. I mean, I think the jury's still out on whether you can do true machine learning, kind of black box machine learning, and be able to validate your model satisfactorily to regulators. That's out. I'd love to hear David talk about that a little bit, actually. I think for me, I'm going back to the really mundane stuff of actually operating a compliance program. But I worry a little bit about a bunch of energy going into building something and then set it and forget it and move on to the next thing, which we've already talked about. Fraudsters are moving faster than we are, and that's just not acceptable. I also kind of worry just from the perspective of kind of algorithms gone wild, right? And we've seen a lot of press on that. So that's one kind of concern I have just from a purely operational point of view. How do you keep this top of mind and for the long haul? And I think the second thing, no, I think I'm going to leave it there.
Okay.
Save that for later.
So that brings up as a good segue for David. I'm curious, I think everyone's debating about how regulators are not keeping up with some of the technology changes and things that are being put in place, both from a perspective from the fraudster's perspective, looking at cybercrime and other technology advances on that side, and then certainly regulating and having that model validation from a service provider, a company that is actually trying to stop the crime. You still need to model that out and be able to validate that what you're doing is satisfactory and is going to be compliant. So if you have thoughts on that, managing that dichotomy.
Well, I would start from the perspective of look to see what it is that the regulator role is. Okay, there are traditional rules, like I mentioned earlier, that have been in place that that now are in evolution, in process of changing. And so one of the things that the regulator role is to look at what is in place now and see what could be done to bring it to a closer alignment with what is the goal of the regulation and the context in which it's being applied. And I think if we wanted to do a report card on that, I would not say that the regulators are failing. I would say, I give them a C plus or a B. You got to give them credit for recognizing the problem. I think there is a recognition of the problem. But from the private sector, I just want to bring this in. There's always this high expectation that because you know that there's a problem, you can move relatively quickly to fix it. Well, that's true if you're in control of all the resources and you have, authority over the people that are doing it. Well, that's not how government works, okay? Government has to have resources, and there are authority chains that fit within a policy framework that have priorities. And it's an ongoing challenge for those who have that responsibility of making that regulation current, up-to-date, and matching the goals that the regulation has, of bringing it to a place where it's the most effective and efficient. And I can only say there's a lot of work that has to be done to modernize our government and regulatory systems to match the challenges that are presented to the goals of what the regulation is. And it's not going as fast as it should, but it's not, to me, to be expected that it's going to be a quick process or that it's going to match the degree and the level of speed of which the private sector is able to kind of put in place things that are more matching of the challenges that they have.
I wonder from John and Erin's perspective if you guys have input on the industry driving some of that or helping in any way shape the future of regulation that sits on top of this. I don't know if you have specific thoughts. It just kind of occurred to me as something that, and I think in the keynote that was mentioned, in this environment that we're in, industries, highly regulated industries like finance and banking may be taking a more active role in pushing the next set of regulations around some of the technology burdens that are happening.
Well, when you go to the Hill and you go talk to senators and representatives, the best piece of advice I ever got was never talk about your company. Talk about how you're going to make life better for their constituents and their consumers. And then you'll get attention. And that's what you need to do relative to these regs. It's like if there are things that are getting in the way and that are causing barriers to consumers to have productive interaction on the internet and conduct commerce, that's what folks want to hear about. And so I think from a standpoint of looking at regulation and things that are getting in the way of that, that's the way to kind of broach this with your senators and representatives.
Yeah, that's fine. So I guess the final question I'll just kind of toss out, and this is very broad, and we talked a little bit about this in our prep, but I guess, how legit do you think machine learning really is? Is it hype, or is it something that's going to evolve and be a helpful tool? How it factors into some of the other things that we've talked about. I think from my own perspective, I think machine learning is not the panacea. It's not the solution. It really is part of this multi-layered approach where you're bringing in and collecting information and looking at it in different ways, but it isn't the solution. So I wonder, just a general perspective on that and any other technologies and solutions that are out there.
I'll go first. I think from my perspective, I've seen it used it's been used very effectively in fraud for a while now, right? It's not new in fraud. I think for money laundering, it's quite a bit more challenging because the signal is very different. You don't get that feedback loop as quickly as you do in fraud when a bad actor comes on. Typically, money launderers don't want to be caught there. So it's a little more challenging. I'm really excited about it in terms of customer risk scoring, and then using it, as you mentioned, to trigger those different levels of ID verification along the way, or collecting those subtly as a result of the signal you're getting. I'm excited to implement that. I'm also I'm excited about the operational aspect of it. To your point, we're never going to be getting rid of analysts. My analysts are getting smarter than ever. Everybody on my team writes SQL queries, right? Like that was not a skill set on your average compliance team not too long ago. But I am looking to have talented people doing things that require talented people, and not sifting through huge false positives all the time. And I think there's a big opportunity there. We're already seeing that play out.
Yeah, I would agree with all that. And I think what I always worry about with machine learning is you can't lose the human touch on this stuff. And because you're competing against somebody who's trying to steal from you, who is using their brain actively, and adapting their tactics, there still is always going to be a human component relative to tweaking the engine here and tweaking what the machine is doing, because they're changing daily in their tactics, and some of that stuff you can't see unless you put your eyes on it, and then you go, oh, that's pretty cool. Look what they did there. So I'm a big believer in machine learning relative to fraud networks, consortium networks, and items like that. But I still think, as Erin said, we still need a lot of smart people to guide it.
Right. Yep.
And let me just play off of that. I think that from a regulator's standpoint, I think that anything that looks like it's going to be better is a good thing to consider and to allow opportunity to have its day. And I think that the idea that you can still have to have a human person in some form goes to the question of what the regulator is wanting, and that's to trust that what's being represented has credibility. And if there's a relationship with the human, and that has been established for prior dealings or other circumstances, and that relationship exists, and the human has now gone to a different level of being able to utilize machine learning to help the human's representations, then that's all good, and it's going to be welcomed as a different, or a better, a more sophisticated way of meeting what is recognized as everybody's new sophisticated challenges, and it'll be welcomed.
So I'm just pass it along the panel for any final thoughts or key takeaways from the discussion, or as we go into this kind of new age, what you would leave the audience with as a final takeaway. And if we have a couple minutes, we'll open it up for questions if anybody has any questions or discussion points. So.
Sure. I guess the themes for me are, I don't think it's all hype, but I also don't think machine learning is the panacea for all of our ails. I'm excited to see the evolving role of kind of traditionally compliance functions in the business, in establishing trust as a kind of value to the bottom line of the business. And I think there's a lot of opportunity in the industry right now to have both, which is better underlying technology and a better customer experience. And I don't see those two things as mutually exclusive.
And I would say, and certainly over the last couple of weeks, this has become very apparent. Identity is core. It's core to interacting on the internet. It's core to all of our businesses. And we need to make sure that when we know who we conduct business with, right? That's been a big problem the last year in a couple places. And it's a complex problem. It's not something that's easily solved. And what you need to do is make sure that you bring in multiple resources and multiple layers. So your own company's data is important. External data is important. Analytics on all that data is important. The data of the consortium is important, right? So it's a multi-layer approach that you really need to look at that kind of pulls in everything and pulls in really good domain resources from other places that are experts on their area. So it's not going to get any easier. and it's probably going to get more expensive. But I think one thing that we all know is that it's pretty core, and we have to make sure that we know who we're dealing with.
And I would only repeat some of what I said before. From a perspective of a regulator looking at this, I think that they're going to look to see, is this risk-based, and does it satisfy the principle that you're applying additional scrutiny to that which deserves more attention? And to the extent that the regulator can be shown that this is a better way of managing that, they're going to be all in on that, and they're going to trust that this is going to work to make it a better way of managing that. But they'll try and verify, and to the extent that you can establish that, they're going to be supportive.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the key in this discussion that I find interesting that came out is really it has to continue to be a combination of using the tools that are available, but that human component has to stay engaged, and that it's not a replacement of anything, but really an augmentation of that. So with that, we have about 5 minutes left. If anybody has any questions or comments. Oh, okay, lots.
That was pretty quick.
You guys both were like simultaneous, so go ahead if you two want to.
Paper, scissors? Right. Hi, Claire Nelson with Sedici. So, to implement machine learning and do some kind of automated processing of data, and I'm coming from the GDPR mindset because of a lot of, so you get that, I saw the nod. Okay. So, how do you apply machine learning and still comply with, say, the GDPR or other related privacy concerns?
Yeah, and I'll just repeat that so everybody can hear, questioning how you apply and remain compliant with new laws like GDPR when you have machine learning as a component. So you've mined and are storing all this data, extensive, more data than ever, but you also have to be able to purge that information and get rid of it on request or on a retention cycle. And we were actually just talking about this beforehand in our prep, and I'll just add, I think the short answer, which isn't very satisfying, is that nobody really quite knows yet. It's still a big conversation, but I'll let the panelists kind of talk about, from their perspectives, what they think about that. Okay.
I mean,
So nobody knows.
It was $1 million question, right? How do you build models based on really nuanced identity and behavior information and allow for privacy? I don't think we've figured it out yet.
Yeah, and I think part of it too is understanding what data has to be removed, and then what the downstream effect of removing that data is going to be on the total model and the process. So I think they're very much at odds with each other right now, and that's really where the struggle is in the industry.
Another thing I would add on that topic is, we're a financial services company, right, and operating within a larger platform entity. And the distinction between financial services record keeping and the GDPR is also kind of unclear right now with regards to all of the behavior-based monitoring you have to do as part of, financial services compliance.
Mm-hmm. Okay. There were a couple other questions. Go ahead. Yeah, you.
Yeah, hi, David from This Is Me. This is actually just a question for Erin. With regard to Airbnb being a truly global player, I'd like to know that how do you reconcile your KYC or your compliance regimen on a region-to-region basis, and are you to a certain extent malleable, flexible with regard to Airbnb as a group and localizing that process?
So I just got a stare from my product manager, who's always pushing me to take a non-global approach. So we operate a global AML program right now with a global KYC regime. That's worked for us so far. I think as we become licensed in further jurisdictions that may have tighter KYC controls, then we're willing to adopt. That could change. So did that answer your question?
To a certain extent, in other words, you stick with the American way of going about things?
Well, actually not really, because as we've heard in multiple parts of the discussion today, Europe is actually taking a lead on a lot of the regulation, and we're also licensed in the UK as an e-money institution. So we're implementing a lot of the Fourth Anti-Money Laundering Directive, for example.
I think it's interesting too around, John talked a lot about consortiums and just access to data to validate and verify. So, we're definitely seeing a much larger need with global organizations to be able to tap into a lot of different types of data sources. It isn't just a driver's license verification. Obviously, that's exclusive to the US. So being able to verify other types of ID and other information that's varied and different, formatted differently, treated completely differently globally.
That's a real challenge.
Yes.
Very real.
Yep. All right. Yeah.
Hey, I'm Nikhil from Amazon. Quick question on the multi-tiered model that you were speaking about. I think the model works really well for screening out fraudsters that either steal an identity or they forge an identity, but maybe not so much for fraudsters that purchase an identity, right, or collaborate with the original owner of the identity. So do you have any thoughts around like how do you screen out fraudsters that are willing to go all the extent to like purchase an identity?
So you're referring to first-party fraud there, or you're just referring to them just buying something on the net?
Buying an identity from the original identity owner.
Yeah. Actually, I think there's a lot of tools to go through on that. Unfortunately, I'm not willing to talk about them because of the fact that could be a fraudster in the audience. But it gets back, and I'd be happy to talk with you in more detail about it individually, but it gets back to looking at the activity that's happening around the transaction, right? I mean, so your data is going to match. So you have to look at other factors, and we call device location and activity-based attributes that can basically help ferret somebody out. Remember that person still needs to create certain things, an email address, they have to come from a geolocation. So there are other factors that you can basically look at. We call that perfect identities. They're just totally 100% correct. And there's also things that you can do relative to, gets to kind of the machine learning of looking at the quality of the data to kind of give you assessments about whether or not it could be potentially stolen.
Right. We're a little bit over time, but we'll do one more, and then we can sidebar for anybody else who wants to.
How about tying to ISPs and where you get your phone? Because, there is a lot that can be done, with purchasing identities and having all the connections and social media and all that kind of stuff, if somebody really wants to do it. So, but how many different identities do you have for your phone? And then I know we talked about forwarding them, but more.
Yeah, I mean, it's all layers again, right? The more layers somebody has to clear, the more quality you can get on their identity. And, we have a direct tie-in with the carrier. So from that standpoint, we're able to get data from that standpoint. So again, it's just multiple sources, multiple ways of looking at things to kind of correlate the data on that identity.
Okay. All right. Thank you for your time, everybody.